So, hello everyone. Welcome to our webinar today on strategies for secondary social studies, develop increased skills for the classroom and beyond. We are so glad to have you here with us this afternoon. I am your host, Jessica Hayes. I am an active classroom certified trainer, and our presenter this afternoon is Jana Kirchner. So Jana is an educator with 30 years of experience. She has served as a school district instructional supervisor, an assistant professor at Western Kentucky University, a social studies consultant, and a high school social studies and English teacher. She also earned her PhD in educational leadership from the University of Louisville. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Jana.
Hi, everybody. Welcome. And we are so excited that you are here with us. We're loving seeing your information pop in the chat box. If you see me glance over this direction, it's looking at the chat box on a different monitor. So we're glad you're with us. Let me tell you a little bit about me and a little bit about what our session is going to be like tonight and how it's going to work. So we said this is strategies for secondary social studies, but honestly, some of the strategies we're going to use will work for all levels. So let me tell you a little bit about me in the context of talking about, okay, what today's agenda is going to be like. So we're going to talk first about what does inquiry look like in social studies, and that's very much in the forefront of social studies methodology and how we teach right now nationally and hopefully in your state as well. So then we'll talk about how do I design inquiry units and lessons, because I think sometimes the idea of inquiry is great, putting it to the concrete, how do I teach this standard that's assessed and how do I make this content fit in an inquiry type of format is a little bit more challenging. So we'll talk about some of the tips that have worked for me in teaching and coaching teachers and just try to have some real practical tips that hopefully will be something that you can use in your classrooms. And then I'm going to show you just a sample, kind of walk you through. We're really not going to do the whole lesson, but I'm going to walk you through lesson and strategy and how I think through a 1, 2, 3, 4 step of organizing inquiry units and lessons. And then throughout, we will have a question and answer, but we'll make sure to leave time for that at the end. So I want to encourage you to please use the chat box. Please give us feedback, ask questions, share ideas. Jessica's going to help me monitor that in case I'm not seeing that as quickly as it pops up. So welcome. I see we've got Arizona, Texas, Washington State, California. We got a content coach. Welcome. We're glad you're with us. So let me tell you also that the very last slide on this is my email information. And if you want this PowerPoint, I will be happy to share it with you. The video will be recorded, as Jessica said, but if you want any of the slides that you're seeing in the PowerPoint or any of the resources that I can share with you that are not somebody else's work, if they're my work, I'll be glad to share. But anything that's not copyrighted as somebody else's, I will be glad to share with you. So I'll make sure you get my email at the end. So let me tell you a little bit about me in the context of doing this introduction and to have a bit of a shameless self promo. I'll do this and then we'll move on. But when I'm in your shoes, I want to know who is this talking head in my Zoom meeting. And so let me tell you a little bit about my background. So I'm a Kentucky person, taught high school social studies and reading, as Jessica said, for several years, taught at university with social studies and literacy methods. Have been an instructional coach working with teachers on planning inquiry lessons. And if I had to say most what I'm passionate about in my professional world, this is going to sound geeky, I know, but it is social studies and literacy and how we get kids to read and write and think in social studies. And ran three different Teaching American History grants where I worked with a university professor and I was the pedagogy person and he was the content expert. And I always say that to say these books are the end of that journey. As we modeled lessons for teachers in professional development sessions for several years, teachers ask us, can you please write those down? So we'll have those. And so some of the stuff I'm going to share with you today is from these inquiry-based lessons. And the format I'm going to share with you that what works for me and my teaching experience and also my coaching is also what I write about. How do I think through planning an inquiry lesson or unit? So you'll see some of the stuff that's going to come from these, and I just put that on there at the beginning. So that's my background. I am currently a social studies consultant after retiring from 27 years of education, a variety of roles. And I do a lot of work for social studies school service too. So thank you for being with us. If you're just joining us, we're going to be talking about inquiry-based lessons in history tonight. So thank you for the feedback to that. If you are just kind of joining us, I'll be glad to share this PowerPoint. So I'll make sure you have my email at the end, and any of the lessons I'm going to show you, if they are mine, I will be glad to share them with you. So welcome, and let's get going. So let me tell you a couple of things, just logistics wise, because we're all in the world of Zoom now. There are going to be a couple of places in the PowerPoint where I'm going to say, please type some responses in the chat box. So if you help out, since I don't get to see all your faces, some of you turned your cameras on, thank you for that. But if you would type some responses in the chat box, that'll help this be much more interactive. So I'll try to be quiet and let you have some time along the way to do that. And you'll see what I'm talking about as we get to it. So here's what I want us to do to start with, because most of your all different states and most of your state standards probably have bits and pieces of inquiry that may be worded a little bit differently. So I wanted us to kind of get on the same page at the beginning and think about, in an inquiry-based social studies classroom, if I just dropped into a classroom that was inquiry-based, what would students be doing or saying? If you could, I'm going to be quiet for a few minutes, and if you could give us some feedback in the chat room, let's see what you think. Okay, they would be doing most, if not all, the talking. So we get student to student talk. Thank you. Asking questions of each other. I love that questions came up. Discussing documents, images, videos. You all are experts at this already. Searching resources for answers, drawing conclusions, multiple sources, points of view, asking questions, digging deeper. Great idea. Thank you for being great participants. It's always more fun as a presenter, as you know, teaching in this world, when people jump in on the chat box. Predicting, finding their own path, comparing sources. Wonderful. We know everything you just typed there is what literacy and what inquiry and social studies are all about. So I wanted you to kind of just generate some thinking there before we talk about, okay, how do I think through it when I'm trying to plan this? Because sometimes, if we're being honest in our safe space here, it's easier to think about it than actually try to figure out how to do it. So when I tried to think about how do I want to organize this short session tonight, I wanted to use questions, because we're in the world of inquiry, we're teaching around questions. So this is our question: how do I design inquiry units and lessons? And so I would say, before you even get started, this is the basic. You got to know your content and skills in your state standards. So we're all coming from different states, different, they might be called inquiry practices, they might be called social studies skills or literacy skills. Every state has a little bit different version of what they name them. But probably not only do you have your content for world history or US history or geography or whatever it is you teach, but you also probably have some sort of skills in your state standards. So you got to just know that, have it in front of you all the time. Then I would say you need to be familiar with what's called the inquiry arc. Some of you may have been studying this for years. Others of you this may be brand new, and that's okay. Nationally, in social studies, we have this C3 framework and this inquiry arc that guides all the state standards. So Kentucky, my home state, has got a year into new standards. Tennessee's got a year into new standards. But most state standards, wherever you are in this journey, feel free to share that with me in the chat box if you want to, are adopting this inquiry arc as the model for how we teach social studies. So you got to kind of know and understand that, and we'll review that kind of quickly. And then I would say you've just got to plan the learning experiences and how you assess your students based on those compelling and supporting questions that guide your units. So let's break that down. We're going to kind of do each of those pieces one at a time. And let's break it down kind of with the C3 framework. And hopefully this is a review for a lot of you, but this has been around since 2013. And this is the framework for standards work in social studies across the country. So if you notice, it has 4 dimensions. So you start with dimension 1, having students develop questions and planning inquiries. Then you explore, you investigate, I like the word investigate a lot, through the content lenses of civics, economics, geography, and history. And then we want students, like you said in your responses, we want them gathering and evaluating sources, developing claims, and using evidence. And then we want them to communicate conclusions that answer those questions. And then I call this last piece kind of our end game. In social studies instruction, I think our end game is that we graduate responsible citizens who can go out in the world, hold a job, and can vote and And that's what I call taking informed action, make a difference in their community, in their state, all those things. So that is the National Foundation, just a quick review of that. And here's the source if you're interested in looking into that in more detail. But then I think we take that and we break that down, and that's got to influence what we do with our instruction. So in that C3 framework, and probably in a lot of your state social studies documents, the types of questions that we teach to are called compelling and supporting questions. So compelling questions, just a quick review of this, are open-ended. They are the kind of questions that might guide a week of instruction, depends on how you plan your units, or maybe you're a 6-week unit kind of teacher. They might guide, they're big enough and broad enough that they would guide the whole 2 weeks, 6 weeks, the whole unit. So they're open-ended. I would say they focus on big ideas of the discipline, maybe the concepts or the concept of revolution, the concept of movement, the concept of citizenship, whatever that is, big ideas in the discipline. They are challenging enough that one of the writers of the C3 framework says they are intellectually meaty, and that's her description for it. So they're going to have some substance to them. They generate interest, so it could be something that applies to the past and applies to now. They allow for multiple perspectives. So in compelling questions, there's probably not one right answer, and you can answer it a variety of ways as long as you have evidence to back up your argument. And that is a key with inquiry-based social studies. So you can answer them a variety of ways. They inspire investigation through the disciplines. So we might look at a big compelling question through the lens of history or economics or geography or civics. And that could all be kind of woven together in how students explore that topic. Sometimes I think, though, that it helps to look at a concept by what it is not. So compelling questions do not have clear answers. If you can answer a question in 2 or 3 words, like the causes of an event, the effects of the event, or sometimes I would even see yes or no answers, then it's probably not compelling unless you make an argument. So if I ask you a question like this is in Kentucky Standards, this is a 3rd grade one. How does where we live affect how we live? How does where we live affect how we live? Well, that's a real complex question that could have history in it, could have economics, could have geography. For it to be a compelling question, if it has a yes or no response, it's got to be students to make an argument. So, are wars worth fighting for? Okay, that might be a yes or no answer, but they're going to make an argument. Are wars worth fighting, dying for? Are there causes worth dying for? I'm just kind of making those up off the top of my head. But it might have a yes or no answer, but students are going to have evidence to back up that argument, and that could still be a compelling question. So they don't just tell what happened. They're not just events. They don't have obvious answers. So those compelling questions, think, are big, broad, gonna guide a whole unit of instruction. So if you're not teaching like that already, I would encourage you to start thinking about that. Sometimes, and I'm going to lump myself in this as social studies folks, not to insult anybody, but sometimes we have a lot of facts in our content, and sometimes it's hard to step above that and see the bigger question. So if you're not kind of thinking about planning around compelling questions, absolutely do that. And I noticed Ryan said, absolutely, yes or no question is okay if you can make an argument and support your answer. Absolutely, I'm glad you pointed that out. And supporting questions then, if we have this big, broad, compelling question that's guiding our unit, supporting questions are more narrow, more focused. They are what I call the scaffolds that support the compelling question. Because if we had that compelling question, how does where we live affect how we live? We're really going to have to break that down into smaller parts to help students manage that content. So they're more focused. They might guide a lesson instead of the whole unit. So they can be answered through concepts, practices of the disciplines. It might be we focus on that question from an economics point of view in our lesson today, or a geography point of view in our lesson today. They can be arranged chronologically or topically. Like I usually tell teachers on this part, how would you teach this unit? What makes sense to teach this to kids to help them understand it? Does it make sense to put it in chronological order if we're talking US history or world history? Or maybe geography, we're going to go topically. We're going to study different regions. So your supporting questions can be built in what I think is the logical way that you would teach that content for understanding. And they're absolutely a scaffold for information to help students build that argument at the end. So this is my favorite graphic. If it helps you to kind of see how it all fits together, so I wanted to share this in this presentation, because here's how I think the big picture looks for planning for inquiry. And for those of you that also do, maybe we have some reading folks in there, it's very similar to reading and writing standards right now. But if we plan for instruction and you think, what's the next unit I'm going to teach? What's the big idea, compelling question that I want students to know? And at the end of that, like we talked about, their assessment will be they're going to build an argument, and they're going to defend that argument with the text and sources that we've been studying throughout the unit. So if this is our end goal for an inquiry unit, we've got to break it down into smaller parts that might be supporting questions. And each of those would have tasks or text. Now that could be, what are the causes? What is the background information? How does the physical geography affect what happened in ancient China? It could be a smaller, more narrow topic, but they're going to examine a text. And a text we're going to define, and this is using literacy language, we're going to define text as anything that communicates a message. So if you will think about that with me just for a minute, let me say that again. Text is anything that communicates a message, or I'm going to say it in a way that's probably not as grammatically correct, anything that kids get information from. And I'm going to flip to the next slide, and I want you to think with me, and please type in the chat box, what type of sources or text do we use to teach social studies? I'll give you a hint. I put some pictures in case nobody answered quickly. So what are things that we use as social studies text? If you would give me some examples. We got maps, we got images, photos, charts, graphs, videos, thank you, websites, primary sources. Absolutely, journals is a type of primary source. Data tables, thank you, Ryan. Anything else we haven't already said? Those speeches, okay? Primary sources, news articles. I would also throw in music, political cartoons, artwork. I don't know if we got artwork in there or not. Posters, pamphlets that jog anybody's thinking. Okay, so let me go back to that one more time, that graphic. I guess let me go back just a little bit. Sorry for the clicking for just a second. So if we think of text in social studies, think about all those things that you just put on your in the chat box. So we're building a unit based on a compelling question where students make an argument, but throughout our planning, we're going to include a variety of opportunities for students to answer smaller, narrower questions using a variety of texts. So one day we might use something from a textbook. Secondary sources, okay, nobody wants to be the one that types that in the box. Sometimes textbook is okay. Or we might show a video, or we might analyze a primary source, or we might look at maps and graphs. So as a teacher, you're trying to build these experiences around supporting questions where students actually interact with a variety of texts, and the students are doing the thinking. So I always tell the story, and I'll tell it quickly, of what not to do, and maybe some of you will smile and laugh and you'll make me feel like I'm not alone in this. But in a lesson observation when I was in the classroom, I had students analyzing a speech, a primary source, a colonial speech, which automatically social studies folks, that's difficult language sometimes, the spelling is a little different. But they had to analyze the speech, and they had to highlight main ideas, and they had to put stars or annotations by things that gave them clues to the time period. Well, I was really excited about that. And at the time, I didn't know that it would probably have been better to do some think alouds and modeling and show them what I wanted to do. I just sort of made the assignment and gave out the highlighters and said, go. Well, you can imagine what happens next. Hands went up all over the room that they didn't understand the language. They were stuck on the first paragraph. Some were smiling, making me feel like I'm not alone in that. And I ended up running around throughout the lesson just solidly explaining. In the first paragraph, he's saying this, and they would write down in their notes exactly what I told them to write down. So you can imagine when I did the formative assessment at the end, or the exit slip, whatever version of that you typically do, whose thinking was being demonstrated on that exit slip? It was mine, because they got stuck and I didn't know to develop the skills to help them do that. And so they just kind of regurgitated my thinking. So I always want to say tasks and text, it's about the students doing the thinking on that. And it's not easy to do. It takes a lot of modeling. And let me show you this plan that works for me. And I'll tell you, this is not anything really complicated, but this is how I think through planning like that. If the compelling questions are in game, then I sort of think through inquiry units in this 1, 2, 3, 4 step plan. And first off, you've got to begin with a question. So if it's a unit, it's a compelling question. If it's a day-to-day lesson, it could be more supporting questions. They could be teacher generated, and you could give them the question that they're looking for at the end, or they could be student generated. I'm going to show you a strategy I like that helps to do that. So the students could generate some questions that could guide the unit, but you got to start with the question. So whether you're a unit planner or a lesson day-by-day kind of planner, this 1, 2, 3, 4 thing will work for both. So what's your question? And then I'd say, what kind of text are you going to add? Remember, our definition of text from this point on is all those things we just brainstorm in the chat feature. So will they look at a map? Will they look at artwork? Will they look at pictures? I would say as much as you can include a combination of primary and secondary sources. But we know as teachers, they don't automatically have the skills, like my non-example of what I did with that primary source. They don't automatically have the skills to be able to do that by themselves. So I put number 3 over to the side because I think 2 and 3 go hand in hand. That along the way, you've got to embed those things that you know are good practice literacy strategies, and teach them how to analyze those sources. So it could be, I'll show you some templates at the end of this, but it could be you use some templates. It could be you have an acronym where you talk about what do we do every time we look at a primary source, or all the things you know, think alouds and modeling and think pair shares and all those things that you know are good practice strategies, because we know they're not going to independently automatically be able to do that. So I sort of think of 2 and 3 together as you're thinking of lessons. What's my text? And then how can I embed some sort of literacy strategy with that to help students develop those skills? And Ryan just said, and sources absolutely should have a variety of perspectives, because we want them to be able to answer that compelling question with a variety of sources, a variety of perspectives, and talk about those different contexts there. So this is the meat of it. All those little scaffolding steps are 2 and 3. And then at the end, they communicate conclusions. And I even use sometimes in coaching teachers, and also in my books, make a hypothesis. And we don't use that hypothesis word very much in social studies. It's kind of a sciencey kind of word, but I like it in a way, because as you talk with students about what do, historians make hypotheses and they support them with evidence. So whatever version you want to use there for step number 4, the key is to get students to answer the question. So whether it was a compelling or supporting, answer that question with evidence from the text, meaning all these things we've studied throughout the unit, to either write an explanation or an argument. So a compelling question you might assess with an argument, whereas more day-to-day lessons might just be that explanation. Let me take a breath for a second, and any questions or comments, any thoughts, anybody else that wants to jump in and share, you like it, you don't like it? Okay, Ann, I'm going to say, teaching your unit on river and maritime civilizations, pre-assessment. I like that you have them analyze the maps. How does where you live? Okay, that's interesting that you did that for those civilizations. That's a Kentucky 3rd grade compelling questions, which I think is a bit challenging for 3rd grade, if I'm giving my opinion. Okay, perspectives of sources. Yes, stay tuned for just a minute and I'll share some things with you at the end. Thank you for sharing. Anybody else have questions or comments? I'm gonna make sure, Jessica, you remind me to talk about some sources for our perspective and bias in case I lose that in thought. Okay, I'm going to just kind of keep on going, but feel free to jump in at any time. So we kind of have the C3 framework, and we have what I think of as the 1, 2, 3, 4. And those of you that you said are coaches, that works really well in planning with teachers too. And it sort of makes this abstract concept of inquiry. And how do we do this? I want to do inquiry, but I also know I have these state standards that say cradles of civilization or Napoleon or George Washington's domestic policy or all these specific things. How do I put all those together? And that 1, 2, 3, 4 kind of way of thinking really helps make that abstract. So, and I would say for new teachers, start small. Start with a question for a lesson and an assessment at the end that uses one source and practices one strategy. So, and kind of build from there. So, the key then, as we think about inquiry and social studies, is students using these sources like evidence. And it's almost like thinking like a detective or an archaeologist. We're using the kinds of sources that you would teach with anyway, that you put in the chat box, photographs and graphs and newspapers and artifacts and maps, all those things. But we're using this variety of sources to help answer questions. Okay, so kind of it's flipping how we think it's teachers as much as anything. So let me show you an example about this. This is one from my book, so I can share this with you. Let's talk about virtual too. Thank you, Calvin. We'll be sure to talk about that too. And I'm going to show you a couple of ways to do some of what I'm sharing with you virtually. So most of you that teach ancient world history teach those cradles of civilization. So I wanted to think about how do we get, and usually there's some state standard about Harappan India and being a civilization. So I want to think, how do we get kids thinking to generate some questions? Because it's hard sometimes to get student generated questions to guide a unit when the students may be coming with no background information. And if we're honest, it's hard for us to come up with good, compelling questions sometimes. So sometimes what I do is a strategy, and this is quick and easy, called I Notice, I Wonder. And this is nothing new. It's been around a very long time. Or it's sometimes called I See, I Think, I Wonder. And I have several varieties of that. And you can search online. There'll be lots of ways to do it. But you've got to put something up for the kids to see, to think about, to generate questions off of. So in this particular lesson, we're not going to do the whole thing, but I want to just kind of walk you through how I would do it and how I would set it up with those parts of inquiry. I would give students the question first and say, write this down. What was life like in the Harappan civilization in ancient India? And that's our question we're going to be exploring. And we're going to look at several clues, and I would set this up with students. We're going to look at several clues and see if we can figure out anything about the Harappans. So teacher talk, I would not have given a homework, or I would not have done a little mini intro or anything yet. So I would just start with some cold thinking about, or just show some images to let them generate some thinking. So you can use I Notice, I Wonder in a variety of ways. And these are seals from Mohenjo-Daro, which is a city in the Harappan civilization. So I would just put those up and as a class practice one together. I remember my bad example of when I made the assignment and didn't practice it. I've learned since then, it helps if you practice together and you kind of tell them what you want them to do. So we would talk about these seals. What do you notice in these seals? And I would have students practice jot this down, all the things you notice, just a very literal description of what these visuals or pictures of artifacts have in them. And then what do you wonder about? So I would talk about that with the class. I might even do some of my thinking to get them started. And then as a teacher, as I'm trying to build an inquiry type of unit, I might write down these I wonder questions on the board or on my Google slide. I'm trying to think Google Classroom right now. I might capture those in virtual world and let those student questions kind of drive what we're going to do next. So I would put one up and I would practice. And then these next few slides I'll show you, and you can have this PowerPoint if you want it, again, if you're just joining us. But I would give them some sort of clue sheet that they could take notes on. So this is one version of it. That's an I Notice, I Wonder that I have used with kids quite a bit, that just has 2 columns, and I will be glad to share it, but it's just a Word document as well. And you're going to teach them and practice with them to literally write down what they notice from the artifacts or the pictures, the maps or whatever, and then generate some questions in this second column. So I Notice, I Wonder. You can also use a clue sheet version of it if you like this. And I think this is fun to do with kids at all ages. I've done this with high school kids, or actually done this with 3rd and 4th graders too. So they're like playing detectives. I would set that up for the little kids. For high school kids, you would just say, you're going to take notes as you look around the room. You could set it up like a gallery walk in the world before COVID or after COVID, where students take their clue sheet and maybe work with a partner, and they go around and they look at the different clues, and they're going to put in this column everything they notice. And then as they look at the clues, and I left blanks on this so you can write the question and have them write that Harapan question here, because everything we're looking at is to help them answer that question of what was life like in Harapan, India. So we're going to examine some clues, and we're going to write down some questions of things we're thinking about. And watch what's going to happen at the end. At the end, we're going to make a hypothesis about what we think about the Harapans only from these clues that we've looked at. We haven't really read anything or had any videos or any other information. We're just building some knowledge at the beginning. So I'm going to click through some slides to show you what it would look like if we did this like a gallery walk. So if you could picture for a minute printing these color slides out, putting them around the room or in the hallway or however you do gallery walks if you use that strategy, and having students walk from clue to clue to capture that information. And I'm going to show you also, Calvin, how to do this virtually too. Thank you for that comment. So notice it has a question at the top. Then we're going to be looking at clues, or I'm going to go ahead and call these texts to use our literacy language. And then we're going to make a hypothesis at the end of what we think about this culture based on the clues we looked at. So we're not really going to do it, but I put the clues in here so you could see them. So if I'm doing this as an intro at the beginning of my unit, I would try to include a variety of sources. So I wanted to have a map because they don't know where this is or when this was. So that was one of my clues. Some more seals. We had done a few together to practice. Some pictures, and these are actually from what it looks like now, but enough I wanted them to be able to get that there are some buildings. And I just got these, I just Googled these. This is no magic history site. So I was thinking I want them to see different aspects of Harapan culture. What can I find online? So we got a building, and we got the grids here. I wanted them to see the grids in the city. We got, not to ruin it for you, but the kids will find out will be a swimming pool or a bath. And then there's a sculpture that's in almost all the textbooks, the picture, and we don't know if he's a king or a ruler or a religious thing. I tried to get, you can tell just from those 8 clues, a variety of things that would just kind of give them an introduction to this civilization. So they would go around in the gallery walk format of it and write down what do you notice? What do you wonder about these clues? And the end part, then they would make a hypothesis. So let me tell you a way to do this virtually. And I had this shared with me, a teacher shared it with me a couple weeks ago. So I will be glad to share this with you if you want to email me. This is a template in Google Slides that is a virtual museum tour. So it is a really fun way to get kids to do kind of a gallery walk virtually. And I just put a screenshot of it, so this is not live, but you click on each of the rooms. So I put the same instructions like I would have done that as a gallery walk. So you enter each of the room and you explore the artifacts. And then when you are finished, go to slide number 7. And had I really done all that with you, slide number 7 says make a hypothesis about the Harapans from your virtual museum tour. So here again, I have my question. So we're exploring this as a question, and we're going to look at all these clues. So if I were to click here on room 4, I wanted to show you what the next piece of it looked like. I put those exact same pictures in the museum room, and I put numbers so the kids could keep up with it on their clue sheet, which clue this was. And then this is not live, but then as you click there, it takes you back to the museum. So they can explore any of the clues, and you could use that for almost any topic. Yesterday, I worked with some middle school teachers, and they were doing the causes of the American Revolution, or that unit you teach, that's the Road to Revolution. And they were putting political cartoons in their museum, and then they wanted to have Paul Revere's engraving in their museum, and then they wanted to have something about the Stamp Act. And so it could be any clues that you would normally do that students would explore. And because you have used I Notice, I Wonder, they're starting to build some background knowledge, but also generate some questions. So what would you do next? I would have them make a hypothesis on the bottom of their sheet that answers the questions, and we would talk about that as a class. And I would kind of pitch it to the kids, like, what are some of our I Wonder questions from this Harappan civilization that we want to explore? I would write those on the board or put that on my Google slide or whatever, and use those student-generated questions to guide what you do next. Honestly, you are probably going to use a video or an article or a textbook excerpt or whatever next, But the way you pitch that to students is, hey, they've generated some questions based on their background knowledge. Now let's look for some answers in some variety of sources that we're going to explore next. So I notice I wonder is such a quick, easy strategy to make that work. And we're going to, as a class, investigate a variety of sources to see if we can find answers. I would sometimes also, I have done this with kids where I have them present their hypotheses and we write those on the board. And you can start it with a sentence starter if you want to. I think Harappans were. And the kids will say from those things, they'll say, I think they were an organized civilization. Well, I'd write that on the board. I think they had rulers because we saw that statue. I think they lived near water. So I might put some common hypotheses on the board and you could leave those up there and then prove or disprove them as they learn more about the culture. So they can kind of check their work, and that's a great exit slip. Like look back at our list of hypotheses from our first day of this unit. Did we prove or did we disprove any of those today from what we learned? That's a kind of great way to tie that back into the first day. So questions, comments about that. It's kind of walking you through how to do that as a gallery walk or a virtual museum tour. While you're doing that, I'll just put some more, I put some examples of some other content up here that work really well for that. We could have why was living in the Jamestown colony so difficult? And we could explore that through a variety of primary sources. So if you are interested in those, I will be glad to share those as well. Those are all online sources, but we're going to try to answer that question together by whatever we do in class, or we might watch a video, or we might have a reading. Most all of these kind of things can be assigned as readings in Google Classroom or whatever your virtual platform is as well. So we could say, here's our question, whether you're face-to-face with me or whether you're in virtual land, why was living in the Jamestown colony so difficult? And the next 2 or 3 days, we're going to see if we can find an answer to that. So look at this primary source of settlers, watch this video, and this is how we're going to wrap it all up at the end and see if we can all explore and investigate that question. It's putting an inquiry spin on what kind of sources you are probably using anyway. So I put some high school examples up there too for some high school folks. I have started a depression unit with a political cartoon. So it almost needs to be a visual that has a lot in it. So like I Notice I Wonder works great with this little political cartoon about FDR because it's got all the letters, the programs there, and then we get Congress and we get FDR as the doctor with his doctor bag. Now students won't know anything about that at the beginning, probably. So when you generate I Notice, I Wonder, and then you can, as you teach your New Deal, Depression New Deal unit, you can go back at the end and say, did we answer any of those questions that we started with on our first day with I Notice, I Wonder? And same thing, I was thinking I wanted to show a government example. You could use a newspaper headline or an article headline. And I was thinking right now this would be very relevant, how the Constitution's Federalist framework is being tested by COVID. You could put a headline up there and have them generate questions off of that to guide what you do with the inquiry unit. So let's go back kind of to our 1, 2, 3, 4, and let me tell you how all that connects. So thinking about our Harappan India unit, so I gave you a question at the beginning. So I told you I would have told students, write this down. What was life like in the Harappan civilization in ancient India? So I gave you that one. So it would have been teacher generated, but also we were going to have some student generated questions from the I Wonder column as well. So if you think of the text, and we didn't really do the lesson, so I'm just kind of summarizing for you, but there was a map, there were pictures of artifacts. Had we done the readings of what comes next, we would have had a textbook and an article and a video. So we had several types of sources there. Literacy strategies, we would have done highlighting main ideas. You could almost call a gallery walk or a museum tour a literacy strategy if you think of text as being visual text, because we're analyzing those paintings and those artifacts and the maps. So we kind of would have done a variety of those. And then for communicating conclusions, I could have you write a response to that question. I could have you, some teachers I know that are doing this lesson in virtual format right now had students create a Google slide and they had to put the question, what was life like in the Harappan civilization? And they had to have 3 pieces of evidence that represented 3 different texts they had studied in the unit. So the text could be the video, the map, the article they read, and then they had to create a visual that represented that text. So their assessment for this particular piece, how they communicated conclusions, was a Google slide. I've even seen teachers do this in a format that I thought was really creative. And they gave students, this was before COVID, they gave students a couple of containers of Play-Doh. And they said, your task is I want you to make a museum exhibit of Harappan India. But here's the catch. It's got to have 4 pieces of evidence from any of the sources that we examined in this unit. And you've got to be able to write an explanation of why you put certain things in your Play-Doh museum exhibit. So that's not an original idea, but I thought that was a great idea. So feel free to use that if that's useful for you. Okay, so somebody asked about how do I get students to analyze sources and perspective? There are a variety of templates. I put a couple of ones that I really like in there, but I have some other ones. If you are interested in following up on a couple of other ones I like, Anne, let me know. But I had to show you the Library of Congress one. So remember in our part 3 of that 1, 2, 3, 4, it's how do we teach kids to analyze sources? So if you are not familiar with these, on the Library of Congress site, they have primary source analysis tools. And I just put a screenshot of the analyzing maps. They have analyzing photographs, analyzing recordings, analyzing letters, just all sorts of, or analyzing primary sources in general. And this part is different. And the questions are different here. So the prompting questions for students to think about are different. But I really like the structure of these headings because it asks students to observe it, just literally describe what you see, then reflect on it. This is kind of more, what do you think it means, or making inferences. Then what questions do you have, which I think really ties in well to inquiry. And then further investigation is how could we find out those answers? So I would encourage you to have some sort of template, whatever one you use, so that when students know, hey, we're looking at a map today, I've got this process I can think through to analyze this map, or I can tackle the speech like I gave you my example at the end, using these things that Ms. Kirschner said I need to do every time I look at a primary source. So I wouldn't necessarily have the students answer all those questions. They're just kind of prompting questions for them to think about as they look at the map. But I put the source on here, but it's just, if you go to Library of Congress, you can find those analysis tools. Has anybody used those before? Let me know if you use those in your classroom. And I also like these from the National Archive as well. And the website is on the bottom there, but you can search National Archives document analysis and these will pop up. Same thing, they have different kinds. They have analyze a cartoon, analyze the artwork, and those are the ones I just put in this presentation. But if you notice, the questions are different under each type of source, but the categories are the same. And I really like their categories as well, because it teaches students the same sort of skills. First, you meet whatever it is you're looking at. If it's a cartoon or an artwork, and you literally do a description. What's it made of? What do I see? What does the title say? What pictures are in it? And then you observe its parts. So you take that sort of the next step, list all the things you see, the people, the objects. And then I like this part too. Try to make sense of it. So here's where we're gonna go to meaning and making inferences. Who do we think drew it? What do you think their perspective was? Is there any clue in this that tells us what time in history this might have been created in our political cartoon? Because you all know those are tough for students to be able to tackle. Or here, what about this artwork? Is it a different time period? Are there any clues to that? And then I like this one as well as the end, that we use it as historical evidence. We've just analyzed this cartoon or this artwork or this artifact. Now, what's it going to tell us about history? The things that, clues that we might be able to figure out about the time period or the place or the perspective of the person who wrote it or drew it or that. So if you haven't used the archives ones or the Library of Congress ones, those are my favorites first. Okay, so that was a lot thrown at you real quickly. So what questions do you have? Or ideas you want to share? quiet. As you're doing that, I'm going to make sure that you have my email. I will be glad to share this, anything that I've shown you tonight with you. If you want to email me, just let me know.
Yeah, I'm not seeing any questions pop up, but only the ones that I think we covered the analyzing perspective of sources. And then one from Calvin, that having little success in the virtual environment. Any suggestions?
Okay. Calvin, let me talk about that a little bit. And I am not a tech expert, so I will say that before I answer your question. Students have loved that virtual museum. And some of my favorite things to do with inquiry are in the virtual world are using Padlet. I don't know if you're familiar with Padlet or not. Like I said, I'm not very techy, so if I can do it, I feel confident that you can. If you go to padlet.com, you can, it's just a discussion board where students put they put their own ideas, but I have used it sometimes to have students generate questions. Like I put the image up and then I have students create a question using Padlet. So padlet.com is a really good way to do inquiry virtually. The Library of Congress has those templates that you can type in the boxes. So those have those that are virtual friendly, if that helps. And also Flipgrid. I really like Flipgrid. And Jessica, jump in if you have some that I haven't used. Flipgrid is Flipgrid. Just go to Flipgrid and it'll tell you how to do it. I promise it's easy. You can ask a question and have students create a real short video and submit those to you. So like I could ask them that question. So tell me what was life like in Harappan, India? And I want you to create a Flipgrid video and post it. And then they would answer that. And I would say, you've got to have 3 or 4 pieces of evidence in it. So that's a real easy one too, Padlet and Flipgrid. Hopefully that helps.
Anne says that she's having a hard time getting to perspectives of sources when the assessment is to analyze a physical map and population map. The bias or perspective of the author is not present. So any ideas on ways to think of this?
Okay, this is off the top of my head. So I don't know how you get bias or perspective if it's a physical or population map. So you may disagree with me on that. I don't know how that would have that. I would, for any of those sources though, just slow down at the beginning. Sometimes I say go slow at the beginning of the year to go fast later. And anytime I put up a map, all right, let's think out loud on this. What do you notice? Well, I noticed it was this time period. Do we have information about the map maker or what country it was from? It's like creating that template of what they think through every time they look at a map. So, but if you're just basic like geography, physical, and population maps, I'm not sure you're going to be able to pull a lot of perspective from that. I don't know if that answered it or not, Anne. So jump back in with another question if I didn't. Oh, ThingLink, Peter shared that one. If you would like the Google Museum slides, just email me and I'll be glad to share that with you. It's just a Google Slides template. Any other questions or comments? Sources to share?
I'm not really seeing any comments or questions popping up in the chat. I did go ahead and put in the evaluation form. If you go ahead and just spend a few minutes filling that out, it will take just a few seconds probably. But we would really appreciate that if you could take the time to do that.
I'm going to go ahead and say thank you, everybody. Thanks for participating and typing in the boxes. Feel free to follow up with me if I can help you in any way. And kudos to teaching right now.